That nurse who thinks she's too good for checkbox charting will need a security escort when she's finally terminated. That is what Dr. Caldwell said 48 minutes before Colonel David Chen coded in room 407. Brooke Sullivan doesn't know this yet. She moves through St. Michael's fluorescent corridors in San Diego with the kind of invisible efficiency that makes people forget she was ever there, a ghost in scrubs, present but unmarked, noticing everything while revealing nothing. The hospital smells like antiseptic layered over copper and something older, something like the dust of too many emergencies compressed into recycled air. She's been here 6 months. 6 months of 12-hour shifts, of charting with the precision of someone filing intelligence reports, of accepting insults with a jaw clenched so small only the mirror catches it. On her locker shelf sits a pair of worn combat boots, size 3 children's, collecting dust beneath her spare shoes. The leather is cracked. The laces are frayed. She touches them every morning before her shift, her fingers tracing the scuff marks like braille. A faint scar traces her left forearm, thin as a wire, running from wrist to elbow, the kind of scar that tells stories only to people who know how to read them. Most of St. Michael's doesn't know how to read anything about Brooke Sullivan except that she's quiet and competent and somehow always in the way when you're trying to cut corners. She arrives at 0600 on a Tuesday, badge clipped to her waist, hair pulled back so tight it aches. The night shift report is already waiting in the break room, 2 nurses slouched over cold coffee, their eyes the color of exhaustion. Sullivan's here, one of them says without looking up, and Brooke knows what this means. The handoff will be meticulous, the kind of clinical precision that shows she's not just clocking in, she's accounting for every minute, every patient, every decision made in the dark hours she wasn't here to supervise. She listens without taking notes. Notes are paper trails. Notes are evidence. But her mind captures everything. Room 407, post-operative day 1, vital stable, drain output minimal, pain controlled, cardiac history noted but resolved. Room 407 is Colonel David Chen. She knows his name from the chart. She knows his vital signs like she knows her own pulse. What she doesn't show is that she also knows his face from a photograph taken 20 years ago in Marjah, a boy of 8, small for his age, pulled from a compound explosion with shrapnel in his chest and his eyes screaming silently. That boy is a man now. That boy is a colonel. That boy is the reason naval intelligence embedded her in this hospital 6 months ago, though her commanding officer would only say the mission was classified and the window was narrow and Chen's routine surgery was scheduled here for reasons that made people very nervous in very high places. Captain wants to see you about your charts, the night nurse says, and there it is, the first crack. Brooke nods once and doesn't ask what this is about because asking questions is emotional engagement and emotional engagement leaves traces. She finishes the handoff, absorbs the patient list, and moves into her shift like water finding its course. The morning is routine until it isn't. The phone at the nurse's station rings, and it's someone from medical records wanting to know why Brooke has flagged 17 billing codes from the past 3 months as requiring verification. The voice on the other end is careful, controlled, the voice of someone reading from a script that wasn't supposed to be needed this early. She listens without responding, because responding is committing. When they ask if there's a problem with her charting, she says, no problem. Precision. Then she hangs up. That's when she sees him. Dr. Caldwell at the nurse's station, scrolling through the computer terminal with movements that suggest he's looking for something specific. His jaw is tight. His fingers are sharp on the keyboard. He's been chief of surgery for 9 years, which means he has relationships on the hospital board, and relationships mean obligation, and obligation means he's been moving money in ways that shouldn't leave paper trails. But Brooke's charting style doesn't just create paper trails, it creates highways. She noticed the phantom equipment charges on her second week, charges for cardiac monitors that appeared on invoices but never materialized in inventory. Inflated pharmaceutical orders that never matched actual consumption rates. Small numbers that didn't add up, which meant someone was taking the difference. Caldwell's voice is smooth when he approaches the medication dispensary. Nurse Sullivan. A moment. It's not a request. She turns from the cabinet where she's pulling medications for room 409, a post-operative hip replacement, and her hands are steady as a surgical laser when she sets down the vials. Of course, Doctor. His smile is the kind that predators wear, all teeth, no warmth. I've noticed your documentation is quite thorough. Unusually thorough. Some might say excessive. He steps closer. The fluorescent lights above them hum their mechanical song. The billing department has questions about your charting practices. Equipment lists. Pharmaceutical counts. Very detailed. Very conspicuous. Brooke doesn't blink. She doesn't shift her weight. The mask is perfect, deferential, slightly uncertain, the face of a nurse who knows her place is to follow orders, not question authority. I chart what I observe, Doctor. Standard protocol. Standard protocol doesn't require line-by-line inventory reconciliation. His voice drops, becomes something colder. It makes people uncomfortable. It makes colleagues wonder if you're questioning their judgment. That creates friction. Hospital doesn't appreciate friction. He pauses, lets the threat sit in the air between them. Do you understand what I'm saying? Yes, Doctor. Her voice is quiet. Perfectly neutral. A nurse being corrected by her superior, absorbing the lesson, filing it away. Inside her chest, her heart rate stays at 62 beats per minute. She's been trained to lie with her physiology as well as her words. He nods, satisfied that she's frightened, and walks back toward his office. But that wasn't the worst part. That afternoon, at the vending machine on the third-floor landing, 2 attending physicians stand waiting for Brooke to finish selecting her coffee. They don't know she's there yet. They think she's already gone. One of them speaks, his voice carrying the kind of casual cruelty that only comes from never imagining consequences. That nurse who thinks she's too good for checkbox charting, Sullivan, she's going to need a security escort when they finally terminate her. Caldwell's got the board moving already. Making calls. The other physician laughs, a sound like ice cracking. Just a power trip. One HR complaint and she's done. Probably angry about something. Women like that, they get bitter, start creating problems. Brooke's hand doesn't tremble when she selects a black coffee. The cup drops into the dispenser with a soft thunk. She inserts her $2 and feeds the machine with the precision of a woman depositing ammunition into a magazine. Her jaw tightens exactly 0.3 millimeters. No one sees. No one registers. She pulls the coffee cup free and moves past them down the corridor, and neither physician registers that she was ever there. That's the skill. That's the training. You walk through the world like you don't exist and most people's eyes slide right past you. But that night, sitting in her car in the hospital parking lot at 1847 hours, Brooke allows herself exactly 20 minutes before she drives home. The rain is coming, she can smell it in the air, that electric copper scent that comes before storms. She grips the steering wheel and doesn't cry, because crying is a luxury for people who get to process their emotions in real time. Instead, she sits very still and breathes very slowly and thinks about a boy pulled from rubble in Marjah with his ribs visible and his eyes finding hers and knowing, somehow, that this person would save him. That boy is upstairs in room 407 now, a man, a colonel, unconscious on pain medication and monitored continuously because his superiors are nervous about something. Her superiors are nervous about something. And Dr. Caldwell is moving against her with the confidence of someone who doesn't understand what he's actually threatening. The rain starts, hammering her windshield like applause for a show she never wanted to perform in. She thinks about the combat boots on her locker shelf, size 3 children's, worn smooth in places from feet that were supposed to stop growing but instead grew into a man who commands respect in rooms filled with generals. She thinks about the paper trails she's created, not intentionally, just through the act of being meticulous, of documenting what she sees, of refusing to let systemic theft pass without notation. 48 minutes ago, Dr. Caldwell made a call to someone on the hospital board. He was careful about what he said. He suggested that Nurse Sullivan's charting style was erratic, possibly retaliatory, possibly the sign of someone unstable. He mentioned the billing codes with practiced concern, as if he was worried about her mental health, as if he was trying to help. The board member listened and promised to investigate, which means the machinery is moving now. Quiet machinery, administrative machinery, the kind that grinds slowly but efficiently toward termination. She has no idea that in 48 minutes, Colonel David Chen will code during what should be a routine post-operative check. She has no idea that his heart will fill with fluid, that his blood pressure will collapse, that the on-call resident will freeze like a statue while the monitors scream their warnings. She has no idea that everything she's trained for, everything she's hidden for 6 months, is about to explode into the light. For now, she sits in her car and allows her hands to shake, just slightly, just where no one can see, and then she puts the car in drive and heads home to her apartment, to her daughter, to the life she's built as a cover for a life she can't speak about. The rain hammers harder. Lightning splits the sky over San Diego. And in room 407, Colonel David Chen sleeps, unaware that his guardian angel was downstairs being systematically destroyed. Grand rounds began at 0800 hours, and Brooke Sullivan stood at the back of the conference room with her tablet, exactly where she always stood, invisible, quiet, part of the wallpaper. 23 residents and attending physicians filled the tiered seating. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like trapped wasps. Dr. Caldwell stood at the podium, holding aloft a patient chart the way a prosecutor holds evidence before a jury. This, he announced, his voice carrying the particular contempt reserved for things he considered beneath him, is an example of dangerously excessive documentation that wastes hospital resources. He flipped through the pages with deliberate slowness. Nurse Sullivan seems to believe she's writing a novel rather than medical records. Every breath. Every fluid output. Every pain assessment with contextual notation. Excessive. Inefficient. A waste of the hospital's time and paper. The residents smirked behind their clipboards. A laugh flickered somewhere in the third row. Brooke's jaw tightened, once, imperceptibly, and then her face returned to stone. Her hands remained at her sides, steady as a sniper's holding her position through crosshairs. She didn't blink. She didn't shift her weight. She simply stood there, absorbing the contempt like it was weather, something that happened to other people. Dr. Caldwell's eyes found hers across the room. He smiled. It was the smile of a man who'd just confirmed something he suspected. Excessive documentation creates liability, not protection. Let's all remember, brevity equals clarity. He set the chart down on the podium with a sound like a closing casket. The room moved on. Next case. Next patient. But something had shifted. The residents looked at Brooke differently now, not as a nurse, but as something marked for removal. An inefficiency that had been publicly flagged. The hierarchy had spoken. At 1,430 hours, Brooke stood at the vending machine in the third-floor break room, inserting coins with mechanical precision. 2 attending physicians stood 3 feet away, speaking in voices just loud enough for her to hear. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. They weren't looking at her, which was worse. You think Clipboard Queen will cry when they finally fire her? The first physician was Dr. Pierce, who'd never made eye contact with Brooke in the 6 months she'd been here. His voice was colored with the casual cruelty of a man who'd never faced consequences. I heard Caldwell's already got HR building a case, the second replied. Excessive charting, insubordination, unauthorized protocols. He's been on the phone with the board. The second physician paused, then added with the weight of certainty, she's gone in a week. Maybe 2. Brooke's hand trembled, no. Her hand did not tremble. She inserted another quarter with steady fingers. The machine hummed its mechanical acceptance. She selected a black coffee, number C7, and watched it fall into the slot below with a dull thunk. She lifted the cup, felt its warmth through her palm, and turned to walk past both physicians. Neither spoke to her. Neither acknowledged her existence. She was already being erased. Later that afternoon, in the staff bathroom on the second floor, a resident whispered to another while Brooke dried her hands at the sink. The girl didn't seem to realize she wasn't alone. Did you hear Dr. Caldwell asked HR to audit her entire file? Apparently her previous hospital references are inconsistent with her credentials. A pause. Then, lower, I give her a week before security walks her out. Probably escorted. Probably during shift change so everyone sees it. Brooke turned off the water. The pipe squealed, the sound of aging infrastructure, of systems slowly failing under pressure. She dried her hands methodically, one finger at a time, and left without looking in the mirror. That night, at 2100 hours, she sat alone in her vehicle in the St. Michael's parking lot with the engine off. The rain had started an hour ago and now hammered the windshield like applause from an audience she couldn't see. Her hands trembled. They shook. They moved through the air in front of her like they belonged to someone else, and she simply watched them shake, letting the tremor travel from her fingertips down through her wrists, her forearms, deep into whatever remained of her composure. She couldn't blow her cover. That was the core of it, the immovable stone at the center of everything. Naval intelligence had embedded her here 6 months ago with a single objective: monitor Colonel David Chen in room 407. The same boy she'd pulled from a compound explosion in Marjah 20 years ago. The same child she'd carried on her back through hostile territory with rounds snapping past her ear like angry hornets. He was grown now, a man, a colonel, a Green Beret himself, and he'd scheduled routine shoulder surgery here, at this hospital, in this city, and her superiors had gone rigid with the kind of tension that meant something was wrong about the timing. She couldn't walk away. Not yet. Not when Chen's post-operative window was opening tomorrow at 1400 hours. Her phone vibrated. Encrypted message from her commander, *Caldwell's digging. Keep cover intact. Chen surgery tomorrow is the target window. Hold position. **. She deleted the message. She started the car. She drove home to the small apartment in Pacific Beach where her 8-year-old daughter was asleep in a room with naval base photographs on the walls that she'd never questioned. The child who'd been told her mother was a nurse. Just a nurse. Nothing more complicated than that. The next morning came too early. Brooke stood in the shower with water that was never quite hot enough, and she thought about what Caldwell had done. He'd moved fast. By 0600 hours, she'd received a call from HR requesting her training documentation by close of business. By 0700 hours, an outside investigator had appeared at St. Michael's, a thin man with a credentialing badge and questions that cut straight to the bone. Your surgical qualifications seem extensive for someone who lists only civilian nursing experience. Can you explain the gaps? Brooke had answered without inflection, I completed my certifications in Washington State, then transitioned to civilian practice. Everything's documented. The investigator had smiled like he'd caught her in a lie she hadn't made yet. By 1100 hours, Caldwell had cornered her in the supply room on the 3rd floor, the room where no one ever looked, the room where compressed oxygen tanks hummed like sleeping animals. She was restocking endotracheal tubes in the crash cart. He'd stepped in and closed the door behind him. The sound of the latch was deliberate. Nurse Sullivan, I've been reviewing your file, he began, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, all power, all threat, no hurry. Your references are unusually vague. Your certifications seem almost too perfect. I'm developing some questions about your credentials. Brooke continued arranging the tubes in their slots, her movements precise and unhurried. Everything's in order, Doctor. Is it? He stepped closer, and she could smell his cologne, something expensive and aggressive, something meant to announce his presence before he entered a room. Because I'm starting to wonder who you really are. She met his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Her eyes were flat, colorless, without the usual deference that had characterized her 6 months at St. Michael's. In those 2 seconds, something flickered across Caldwell's face. A moment of doubt. A recognition of something he couldn't name but could sense, the way an animal senses a predator in the water. Then Brooke looked back down at the tubes and continued her work. She walked past him 30 seconds later, her shoulder brushing his without apology. He didn't move. He simply stood there in the supply room with the oxygen tanks humming around him like a prophet who'd just glimpsed something true and terrible. By 1300 hours, she'd been summoned to her supervisor's office. The chief of staff had been there as well, a woman named Dr. Mercer who'd never shown particular interest in Brooke before but whose expression now carried the weight of institutional authority. "We're implementing immediate restrictions on your charting," the chief had said, reading from a prepared statement. "You're to document only essential elements. No contextual notations. No extended assessments. You're also prohibited from performing any procedures beyond basic nursing scope without explicit physician authorization." Brooke had nodded once. "Understood. You understand that this restriction is in effect immediately while we conduct a review of your credentials and your work history at your previous facility." "I understand." The chief had exchanged a look with her supervisor that suggested they'd expected more of a reaction. Some defensive response. Some emotion. They'd gotten neither. Brooke had simply accepted the restriction the way she'd accepted every restriction in her military career, as an obstacle to be navigated, a rule to be understood and worked within. Her supervisor had almost looked sad about it. That evening, Brooke's 8-year-old daughter, Marjah, had found her sitting on the apartment's small balcony with the Pacific stretched out below like something infinite and indifferent. The sun was setting into it, turning the water the color of blood and amber. "Mommy, why have you been so quiet?" Brooke had forced her face into something like a smile, the expression she used when covering wounds or drawing blood, the professional mask of someone who'd learned to hide pain beneath layers of training. "I'm just thinking about work, sweetheart. Do you not like your job anymore?" The question had struck her across the chest like a physical blow. Brooke had pulled her daughter close, breathing in the smell of apple shampoo and childhood, and had not answered, because any answer would be a lie, and she'd already lied to this child every single day of her life. She'd received Chen's updated chart at 2,230 hours. Routine post-operative monitoring. Standard recovery trajectory. The surgeon's notes indicated no complications expected. Should be simple. Should be straightforward. But Brooke had studied combat medicine for over 2 decades, and something in her nervous system, the part that had learned to read ambushes in the silence before firefights, told her that nothing about tomorrow was going to be simple at all. The timing felt wrong. Chen's placement here felt wrong. Caldwell's sudden aggression felt coordinated, like a move on a chessboard that had already been planned 3 moves in advance. She lay in bed, listening to the rain continue its assault on the city, and she understood with crystalline clarity that the next 24 hours would end one of 3 ways. Chen would survive his recovery, she'd extract herself from St. Michael's, and her cover would remain intact. Or everything would blow apart simultaneously. Or she would have to choose between her daughter and her patient, between the life she'd built and the life she'd sworn to protect. At 0530 hours, Brooke got out of bed. She put on her scrubs. She tied her boots, not her regular clinical shoes, but the soft-soled combat boots she'd worn in Marjah, the one she kept in the bottom of her locker in case extraction came fast. She kissed her sleeping daughter's forehead. And she drove back to St. Michael's to wait for 1,400 hours, when Colonel David Chen would wake from surgery, when the post-operative window would open, and when everything she'd built would either hold together or collapse entirely. The rain continued falling. The city waited, unaware that a collision was approaching. The surgery finished at 11:19 a.m. Clean closure. No complications. Chen's chest rose and fell with the rhythm of the ventilator, his post-operative orders printed and distributed before Brooke could even remove her surgical mask. That was the first sign something was wrong. Dr. Caldwell didn't typically hover over post-op protocols. He didn't typically care about the mechanics of recovery, only about the speed at which patients moved through his operating theater and out of his responsibility. But today he did care. He stood at the nursing station, reviewing the orders line by line, his fingers drumming against the counter with the rhythm of calculation. His navy blazer, Tom Ford, probably $3,200, hung perfectly over his shoulders as he leaned forward to speak directly to the charge nurse, Patricia Holloway, a veteran who'd worked at St. Michael's for 16 years and knew better than to question a department head. Extended monitoring intervals, Caldwell said, his voice dropping into the register he used when making decisions that weren't actually suggestions. Every 4 hours. The patient stable. Routine post-op. Assigned this one to Jenkins. Marcus Jenkins was a third-year nurse. Competent with paperwork. Quick with vital signs documentation. Completely unequipped to interpret the subtle language of a patient's physiology, the whisper before the scream. Brooke watched from the supply closet, pretending to count dressing packs. She'd learned this particular skill set in a forward operating base near Sanjin Valley, the art of being present while remaining invisible, of watching while appearing to look away. Her hands moved through the supplies mechanically, gauze, tape, saline flushes, while her mind catalogued what she'd just heard. Extended monitoring intervals on a post-operative cardiac patient. A junior nurse assigned to a green beret whose surgical file contained notation she'd memorized during the 72 hours of preparation before his admission: cardiac arrhythmia history, previous pericardial inflammation, family history of sudden cardiac events. The file was buried in the system, accessible only to surgical staff and upper-level nursing. Caldwell had read it. Which meant Caldwell knew exactly what risk profile he was looking at. Which meant he was doing this deliberately. The implications moved through her nervous system like electrical current. Caldwell wasn't trying to harm Chen, not directly. He was testing her. He'd noticed her obsessive attention to his chart. He'd calculated that she would monitor Chen regardless of her assignment, and if she intervened in any way, he would have caught her in the act of violating scope of practice. A nurse monitoring a patient she wasn't assigned to could be documented as insubordination. Could be flagged in her file. Could be ammunition when the credential review concluded. It was competent sabotage. It was the work of a man who'd learned to weaponize the system itself. Brooke closed the supply cabinet with a soft click and walked to the post-operative floor. Her assignment had been adjusted during surgery. She now had 4 other patients, all stable, all requiring routine care. The staffing model ensured she would be occupied, distributed, unable to focus her attention on room 407 without creating a visible pattern that Caldwell could observe and document. She found Patricia at the main desk, reviewing the shift assignments. The charge nurse's expression was careful, neutral, the expression of someone operating within institutional boundaries. "Colonel Chen's doing well," Patricia said quietly, not looking up from her computer. "Dr. Caldwell wants minimal disruption. Standard post-op protocols. His chart shows cardiac history," Brooke said. Her voice was even, professional, the voice of a nurse making a clinical observation. 10 years ago, she would have delivered this as information. Today, every word had to calculate as non-threatening. "I'd recommend closer intervals. Every 2 hours at minimum." Patricia's jaw tightened. She looked up, and in her eyes was something that resembled apology. "Dr. Caldwell's orders are clear. Every 4 hours. Jenkins is assigned." The words closed like a door. Brooke nodded, accepting the rejection with the kind of stillness that came from having learned to absorb defeats in forward positions where a visible emotional reaction could get people killed. She turned back toward her other patients, her mind already reshaping itself around the new constraints. She would find ways to move through the post-op floor that felt purposeful. She would document her proximity to room 407 as incidental. She would watch. Her phone was in her pocket, a burner, encrypted, carried in the same way some people carried rosaries. No one knew about it. No one could know about it. Her commander's last message had been categorical, *cover compromised. Extract yourself. But extracting herself from a monitoring assignment while the asset was actively post-operative would trigger every alarm Caldwell had positioned. The credential review was still in motion. She had perhaps 12 more hours of cover remaining, maybe less. Enough time to watch. Enough time to ensure Chen stabilized. Then she would run. The next 4 hours moved with the slow precision of a clock under observation. Brooke completed her other patients' assessments, wound checks, dressing changes, fluid intake output monitoring, pain management evaluations. The work was second nature. Her hands and her mind could execute these tasks simultaneously, leaving the part of her consciousness that had been trained in field medicine free to calculate probabilities and trajectories. She positioned herself strategically. The supply closet was visible from the hallway near room 407. The medication station offered a sight line through the glass partition. She made trips to the crash cart on the post-op floor, always moving with purpose, always appearing to belong exactly where she was. She was a ghost in the system, present and absent in equal measure. At 3:15 p.m., Chen's heart rate began to climb. Brooke caught it on the monitor display as she passed the nursing station, a quick glance that a casual observer would have interpreted as peripheral awareness. His heart rate was 102 at 3:12. By 3:15 it was 108. His blood pressure had drifted down slightly, 118/70 where it had been 126/76 post-op. She turned away from the monitor and walked into the medication room, locking the door behind her. Her breathing remained steady, trained, controlled, the product of 15 years of operating in environments where panic was a fatal liability. She counted her heartbeats, bringing her own physiology back to baseline while her mind processed the clinical data. Post-operative blood pressure drift could mean a dozen things. Dehydration, pain, anxiety, normal recovery fluctuation. But combined with climbing heart rate, combined with his cardiac history, combined with the extended monitoring intervals and junior nurse assignment, the pattern began to form a shape she recognized. The shape of someone preparing to watch a patient deteriorate. But that wasn't the worst part. She opened the locked cabinet where high-risk medications were secured and confirmed what she'd already verified 3 times over the past 16 hours. The rapid fluid replacement protocols for post-operative cardiac patients were in the system. The equipment was available. If Chen's condition deteriorated, if he crashed, the resources to save him were present and accessible. Caldwell wasn't trying to let him die. He was trying to create a situation where Brooke would have to choose between her cover and his survival. A no-win equation. Caldwell's specialty. She locked the medication cabinet and left the room, her hand steady as a surgical laser, her expression unchanged. She had work to do. Other patients. Other vitals to monitor. Other reasons to move through the post-op unit that had nothing to do with room 407. But as she walked past Chen's room, she allowed herself a single moment of sightline into the space. Marcus Jenkins was documenting something on the computer terminal. Chen's eyes were closed, the sedation still heavy in his system. The monitors above his bed displayed the climbing heart rate, the drifting pressure, the early signs of a system beginning to compensate for something it shouldn't have to compensate for. Pain is data, her instructors in Portsmouth had told her. Every symptom is information waiting to be decoded. By 3:24 p.m., Chen's heart rate had reached 115. His blood pressure was 114/68. The gap between his systolic and diastolic pressures was narrowing, a sign of compromised cardiac output. His respiratory rate had increased from the baseline post-operative 14 to 18 breaths per minute. Brooke was in her other patients' rooms, performing her assigned work, her movements purposeful and documented. But her attention was rooted in room 407. She could feel the deterioration the way some people claim to feel where the system's moving in, a pressure change in the atmosphere around her. The air in the post-op unit had taken on a different density. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to hum with a frequency that only she could hear. At 4:03 p.m., Marcus Jenkins finally noticed something was wrong. She heard the alarm before she saw anything, that specific tone that meant a heart rate exceeding threshold parameters. A nurse's beacon. A signal sent into the hospital air that something needed attention. Jenkins' voice came next, uncertain. "Young Dr. Caldwell? I'm getting some elevation here. Should I?" "I'll be right there," Caldwell's voice responded over the intercom, coming from somewhere in the administrative wing. Standard post-op tachycardia. Likely anxiety or pain. Increase the sedation parameters. I'll review the chart in 5. Brooke was moving before she consciously decided to move. Her assignment had been updated to include a medication delivery to the 4th floor, away from post-op, away from the room where a patient's heart was beginning to struggle against something his body couldn't yet identify. She had perhaps 90 seconds before that situation became irreversible. 90 seconds before the deterioration crossed from manageable to catastrophic. She calculated the extraction timeline. She calculated the consequences of intervention. She calculated the cost of doing nothing and found it exceeded the cost of everything else. Her commander had told her to run. But some missions took longer to complete than the timeline allowed. Some patients couldn't wait for extraction protocols. Some moments required a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Brooke turned back toward room 407, knowing that every step forward would be a step away from the identity she'd built over 6 months, away from the civilian nurse named Brooke Sullivan, away from anything resembling a safe extraction. But Chen was crashing, not yet, but soon, in seconds that were counting down like a clock tower she could hear even though no one else could, and his heart was beginning to collapse under the weight of something accumulating inside his chest. She reached for the door handle. Her hand was steady. Her breathing was steady. Only her mind was moving at the speed of combat decisions, calculating angles and options and outcomes at the speed of light. And then she saw it, the specific pattern on the monitor display through the glass partition. The muffled heart sounds she could almost imagine hearing. The subtle widening of the mediastinum that would show on any chest film. The classical presentation she'd studied in field medicine courses and seen twice in actual combat zones, both times requiring the exact same intervention, both times requiring hands steady enough and brave enough to push a needle through the pericardium into the space where fluid was beginning to compress a heart. She pushed open the door to room 407. Marcus Jenkins looked up, surprise registering across his face. "Nurse Sullivan, you're not." "Get me a 14-gauge angiocath needle," Brooke said. Her voice had dropped an octave. The timid nurse was gone. In her place stood someone else entirely. "Now." "Second intercostal space supplies. And call for Dr. Caldwell. Tell him the patient is going into shock." She was already moving toward Chen, her hands moving on their own, muscle memory, field training, the part of her that had been waiting 20 years for permission to save this specific person's life. Her fingers found the anatomical landmarks, the second intercostal space, the midclavicular line, the exact point where a needle could pass through skin and muscle and pleura into the pericardial sac where fluid was accumulating like evidence of a crime. Jenkins hesitated. Then moved. The sound of him running down the corridor, calling for equipment, calling for help. The monitor beeped its escalating alarm. Chen's eyes opened briefly, confusion and pain registering before the sedation pulled him back under. And Brooke Sullivan, Master Chief Petty Officer, Embedded Operative, burnt-out cover identity, stood with a needle in her hand and 60 seconds to save a life she wasn't supposed to be touching, knowing that everything, 20 years of discipline, her commander's orders, her civilian identity, her entire hidden war, was about to end. She could hear Caldwell's footsteps in the hallway. Getting closer. Still seconds away. She pushed the needle forward and felt it pierce through. The hiss of air escaping. The specific sensation of the point breaking through into the pericardial sac. The resistance changing. And then the plunger moving back, drawing out the crimson fluid that had been slowly crushing the heart of the boy she'd pulled from a compound explosion in Marjah 2 decades ago, the boy who was now a man, and who was now her patient, and who was now going to live because she was willing to sacrifice everything to ensure it. The fluid withdrawal was immediate. Chen's blood pressure began to climb. His heart rate began to stabilize. The monitor's alarm tone changed, the urgent escalation shifting back toward normal parameters. 30 seconds elapsed. 45. By the time Dr. Caldwell appeared in the doorway, his face already prepared with expressions of concern and competence, the crisis had passed. What he saw was not a complication. What he saw was a Master Chief Petty Officer, fully emerged, standing over a patient with a needle she shouldn't have had, performing a procedure she wasn't authorized to execute, having just revealed herself completely. Room 407's heart monitor had begun its death song. 1 beep. Then 2. Then the flat, accusatory silence between them stretched like a held breath before the fall. Colonel David Chen's lips had turned the color of bruised plums. His jugular veins distended against the pale geography of his neck, swelling with each failed heartbeat. The on-call resident, Dr. Marcus Webb, 28 years old, 3 months into his cardiothoracic rotation, stood frozen at the foot of the bed, his mouth open like a fish pulled from water, his eyes fixed on the monitor as if staring hard enough could reverse what he was witnessing. 72. 68. 54. The numbers fell like a man tumbling downstairs. "We should call for assistance," Webb said. His voice cracked on the word assistance. "We should page Dr. Caldwell. We should." The door opened. Brooke Sullivan didn't run. Running would indicate panic. Running would draw attention. She moved the way she'd learned to move in compound corridors in Helmand Province, economical, purposeful, present. Her assessment took 1.3 seconds, cyanotic lips, JVD visible from the doorway, diminished heart sounds on the monitor, a patient drowning in his own fluid from the inside while Webb stood paralyzed beside him. "Get me a thoracic needle kit," Brooke said. 18 gauge. "Now." "We should wait for," Webb began. "He'll be dead in 60 seconds. Her voice didn't rise. It dropped instead, the way a predator's voice drops when it stops playing. "Do you want to explain to his family why you waited, or do you want to move?" Webb moved. His hands fumbled through the crash cart like a child's hands, knocking over a tray of supplies, nearly dropping the sterile field. Brooke was already at Chen's bedside, her fingers moving across his sternum, feeling for the landmarks, the xiphoid process, the intersection of the fifth intercostal space, the precise geography of survival. Her hands were steady as a surgical laser, the muscle memory of 20 years compressed into the 30 seconds they didn't have. She prepped the insertion site with betadine. The iodine smell rose up sharp and chemical, cutting through the antiseptic hum of the room. Her fingers found the angle, 45 degrees, advanced beneath the xiphoid process, aimed toward the left shoulder. The needle slid forward like a key sliding into a lock made specifically for it. The syringe filled with blood. Crimson. Arterial red. The pressure relieving itself from around Chen's heart, the fluid that had been suffocating his cardiac function draining away with a soft hiss of air escaping. Each milliliter she withdrew was a second of additional life he didn't have before. 20 milliliters. 40. 50. O2 sat. Brooke said. 82. "It's climbing," Webb whispered. 87. 92. Brooke advanced the needle 2 more millimeters and withdrew the final column of blood. 94%. Normal breathing room. The monitor began to sing again, not the death rattle but the steady, 4-beat rhythm of a heart that had been given permission to keep beating. Chen's lips flushed from bruised purple to human pink. The jugular vein subsided like a tide pulling back from shore. Brooke withdrew the needle with the same controlled precision she'd used inserting it. She applied pressure to the insertion site with sterile gauze. Her hands didn't shake. They never shook. Shaking was something that happened to people who weren't trained for the moment immediately after they'd just performed field emergency surgery in a civilian hospital in San Diego with a resident who was currently looking at her like she'd just pulled a rabbit out of the air. "Call cardiothoracic." "Cardiac tamponade secondary to post-operative hemorrhage," she said, discarding the needle into the sharps container. "Get an EKG. Get an echocardiogram. He needs imaging to confirm fluid reaccumulation risk. Monitor his vitals every 15 minutes for the next 4 hours." Webb nodded. He was nodding the way people nod when they're still trying to process what they witnessed. "How did you or where did you learn?" "St. Michael's Protocol for Post-Operative Complications, Dr. Webb. Page Dr. Caldwell. Tell him his patient is stable. I'll document the intervention." The door was still swinging open when Caldwell arrived. Not rushing. Walking. Walking the way a man walks when he's received a phone call that's just changed the equation of his entire day. His eyes moved from Chen, now pink-cheeked and breathing normally, to the cardiac monitor, now sinus rhythm, steady and sure, to Brooke, still standing at the bedside in her scrubs, her gloved hands holding the soiled gauze, her face a mask of professional calm. She saw his face go white. Not with gratitude. Not with relief. With calculation. With the specific kind of white that comes when a man realizes something that doesn't fit into the world he's constructed has just walked into his operating room wearing a badge that says RN and moved like a green beret. Where did a nurse learn field surgical intervention? Caldwell's voice was ice. Ice at absolute zero, the kind that burns. Continuing education, Dr. Caldwell. ACLS certification includes emergency pericardiocentesis protocols. Colonel Chen's tamponade was progressing rapidly. The intervention was textbook hospital procedure. Caldwell's jaw tightened. His eyes moved from her hands to her face to her composure, that unshakable, unafraid, we both know exactly what you just witnessed composure, and she watched something crystallize behind his pupils. Fear. Not of her. Of what she'd just revealed. He turned and left the room without another word. The next 2 hours moved like a chess match conducted in fast forward. At 2:22 p.m., Brooke was called to the Chief of Staff's office. She'd expected this. She'd been prepared for this since the moment she'd advanced that needle. The cover was compromised. The mission was over. Naval intelligence would have already begun the extraction protocol. Caldwell stood beside the Chief of Staff's desk, his arms crossed, his face arranged into an expression of professional concern that didn't quite reach his eyes. Nurse Sullivan, we've received a concerning report about your credentials, the Chief of Staff began. His name was Dr. Harrison. He'd hired her 6 months ago without looking too carefully at her background because her references had checked out, all of them fabricated by people with access codes to federal databases, and she'd been exactly what St. Michael's needed, a nurse who worked overtime without complaining and made the entire floor run smoother. Dr. Caldwell has informed us that you performed a procedure this morning that requires physician supervision and falls outside the scope of practice for nursing staff. Before we can proceed, we need to verify your training documentation. Your military service records. Your actual background. Brooke's expression didn't change. I performed life-saving intervention consistent with ACLS emergency protocols, Dr. Harrison. Colonel Chen was experiencing acute cardiac tamponade. The procedure was appropriate and necessary. Regardless, Caldwell said, his voice smooth as oil, your credentials have raised some questions. We received a call from your previous hospital this morning, St. Joseph's in Portland, inquiring about whether we'd actually verified your nursing license before employment. Apparently they have no record of your training there. And we've also contacted your references. Several of them appear to be disconnected phone numbers. He smiled. It was a smile like a knife smiling at a throat. Effective immediately, you're suspended pending a full investigation into your background, your credentials, and the extent of your unauthorized medical practice. Hospital security will escort you from the building. You'll receive formal documentation via certified mail. Brooke nodded. She didn't protest. She didn't ask questions. She simply turned and left the office with a security guard, a retired Navy man named Thompson, who looked at her face and then looked away, the way people look away from things that are too bright to stare at directly. Her phone buzzed as Thompson was walking her to her car in the parking lot. A text from a number without a name, * cover compromised. Extract yourself. Mission scrubbed. Report to debrief facility 1800 hours. All further contact through secure channel only. *. She drove home at 2 p.m. on a Wednesday in her 12-year-old Honda Civic. Still in scrubs. Still smelling of iodine and latex. Still carrying inside her chest that particular kind of hollowness that comes when you walk away from something you've been building for 20 years. At her kitchen table, the one she'd bought at a yard sale in Point Loma, the one her daughter had learned to color at, the one that held 8 years of an identity she'd constructed as carefully as any covert operation, Brooke sat in silence. The house was quiet in the way only houses can be quiet when all the people in them are gone during the day. She stared at nothing. Her hands were folded on the table. Her mind was calculating extraction routes, what she could take, what she'd have to leave behind, how to explain any of this to the child who would walk through the door in 42 minutes wondering why Mommy was home early. When her daughter Emma pushed through the front door at 2:56 p.m., she found Brooke exactly as she'd left her, sitting at the kitchen table, still in hospital scrubs, her eyes fixed on something that wasn't visible to anyone else. "Mommy." Emma's voice was small. 7 years old. Second grade. She'd packed her own lunch that morning and drawn a picture of a horse wearing sunglasses for art class. "Why are you home? Are you sick?" Brooke looked at her daughter. She looked at this life she'd built, this identity she'd cultivated, this version of herself that had been so carefully constructed that even she sometimes forgot where the cover ended and the woman began. She looked at Emma's confused face, confused because her mother was crying, and her mother didn't cry. Her mother was the strong one, the one who fixed things, the one who made everything okay. "I'm not sick, baby," Brooke said. Her voice was steady. It always was. I'm just going to need some help today. Okay?" Emma dropped her backpack and wrapped her 7-year-old arms around her mother's neck. She didn't understand. Children never do. They just know that when someone they love is hurting, they should hold on tighter. Brooke's phone buzzed again. Then again. Orders cycling in. Debrief protocols activating. The machinery of naval intelligence beginning its extraction process. But for now, in this moment, she just held her daughter. She held this version of her life that was about to disappear. And she let herself feel, for the first and probably last time in 20 years, exactly how much it was going to cost to walk away. The next morning, Brooke returned to St. Michael's to collect her belongings from her locker. She wasn't supposed to return. Protocol was extraction and radio silence. But Emma's guinea pig was in a cage in the break room. Her favorite scrubs, the ones with the tiny surgical instruments embroidered along the sleeve, were hanging in her locker. There were 8 years of life in that building that couldn't be evacuated in a phone call. The moment she turned the corner toward the staff entrance, she knew something had changed. There were vehicles outside that hadn't been there yesterday. Hums with government plates. Security personnel in unmarked windbreakers. The kind of coordinated federal presence that meant something much larger than a nurse investigation had converged on St. Michael's Hospital. She kept walking. Master Chief Petty Officer training meant knowing when to advance and when to observe. She observed. The hallway outside Chen's room had been transformed into something between a military checkpoint and a crime scene. Armed personnel in civilian clothes. 2 uniformed Navy officers. And being wheeled past on a gurney, escorted by what looked like a full security detail, was a man whose face Brooke recognized immediately. Not from St. Michael's. From Kandahar. From a compound in Marjah. From her interrogation she'd conducted in 2004 in a building that didn't officially exist. The Taliban commander turned CIA asset, Rashid Karimi, call sign Air Jackal, though nobody called him that anymore because he'd spent the last 18 years turning intelligence for 3 different branches of government, stopped breathing for exactly 1 second when he saw her face. His eyes widened. The color drained from his face in real time. He whispered something in Pashto. Then in English. "Phantom," he said. The word hung in the air like a prayer or a curse, depending on which side of his particular history you'd been standing on. The hallway went quiet. Not the normal quiet of a hospital. The specific quiet that happens when everyone stops moving at once. A Navy veteran working hospital security, a man named Patterson, discharge papers from Fort Pendleton, recognition algorithms in his brain trained to spot certain faces and certain bearing, went rigid. His hand moved unconsciously to his chest. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd just identified a ghost he didn't expect to see in daylight. "Wait," he said. "That's Master Chief Petty Officer Sullivan's call sign." The silence that followed that statement was absolute. Employees. Residents. 2 attending physicians who'd been walking past stopped mid-step. All of them watching Brooke. All of them seeing her for the first time exactly as she actually was. A 3-star general stepped forward from the cluster of military personnel. He was holding a file folder, her file folder, the one that had been sealed and classified for 2 decades. He opened it with methodical precision. His voice was measured, official, the voice of institutional authority acknowledging something that had always been true but had never been spoken aloud in this space. 3 Navy crosses, he said. He paused. Let that settle. 2 silver stars. The residents exchanged looks. One of them pulled out a phone. For bronze stars with Valor, the general continued. 20-year career with Naval Special Warfare. 47 confirmed combat saves. Master Chief Sullivan, we've been looking for you. The words hung there. 47. 47 lives pulled from burning buildings and compound rubble and IED blast zones. 47 versions of events where someone else had made a different choice and hadn't made it home. 47 reasons why she'd learned to move the way she moved and think the way she thought and stay still the way she was staying still right now. The door to Chen's room opened. He stood in the doorway, still pale from post-operative bleeding, still connected to monitoring equipment, but upright. Alive. His foot-pole trembled slightly in his grip, but his eyes were steady. That woman pulled me out of a compound in Marjah when I was 10 years old, he said. His voice was raw from intubation. It cracked on the final word. She shielded my body with her own while calling in airstrikes on her position. I was wearing these. He held up his phone. On the screen was a photograph of a pair of combat boots. Children's size. Scuffed. Worn. Kept for 20 years. 10 seconds of absolute silence. The kind of silence where you can hear fluorescent lights humming and the distant sound of a monitor beeping and the collective realization that they'd all been standing next to a legend the entire time. Dr. Caldwell tried to slip away. His face had gone the color of old parchment. His hand reached for the stairwell door. Dr. Caldwell, the general said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. You're not going anywhere. Your network's been audited. Your billing fraud has been documented. Your partnership agreements are being reviewed. And you're going to have a lot of explaining to do to the FBI. A resident's phone vibrated. Then another. Brooke could see the notifications arriving in real time. The video was already viral. 47 likes. 200. 5,000. The identity reveal happening in fast forward, spreading through social media like water finding cracks. True class is what you do when the lights go out, Brooke thought. And she had no idea, standing in that hallway with her life rematerializing around her, that the lights had never actually gone out. They'd just been very, very dim. The next morning, Brooke returned to St. Michael's to collect her belongings from her locker and found the entire east corridor transformed. Hums idled in the ambulance bay. Armed security personnel in tactical gear stood at every checkpoint, their presence so precise and lethal that the morning shift nurses moved around them like water around stones. The hospital security guard, a Navy veteran named Morrison with a faded anchor tattoo on his neck, stood rigid at the entrance to the 4th floor intensive care unit, his hand resting on the radio clip to his belt. He nodded at Brooke once, a gesture heavy with recognition. She understood immediately. They were here for Chen. She moved through the corridors with the same measured pace she'd maintained for 6 months, the same composure that had carried her through Marjah and 30 years of classified operations. Her scrubs hung on her frame like a borrowed costume that no longer fit. The badge with her civilian credential dangled from her neck, a prop from a play that had just ended its final act. When she reached Chen's room, she found it crowded with military personnel she didn't recognize, and one person she'd hoped never to see again. The man sat in a medical isolation room 2 doors down. He was thin, scarred, with eyes that had watched things no one should watch. A former Taliban commander. A defector. A CIA asset now being treated for a septic infection that antibiotics alone couldn't touch. The moment his eyes found hers through the reinforced glass, his entire body went rigid. His lips formed a single word, whispered so quietly the attending physician didn't hear it, but Brooke did. Phantom. Terror and reverence mixed in that one syllable, the voice of a man who had heard that call sign whispered in compounds and valleys and detention blocks across 2 decades. He had seen her face exactly once before, the night she'd extracted intelligence from a checkpoint he'd been guarding, the night she'd disappeared into darkness like smoke. Morrison stepped forward, his jaw tightening. He'd been watching the screen monitoring that room. He'd seen the reaction. "Wait," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs of doctors and nurses. His eyes locked on Brooke's face with sudden, absolute certainty. "That's Master Chief Petty Officer Sullivan's call sign." The room didn't just go quiet. The room stopped existing. Conversations died mid-sentence. A monitor's rhythmic beeping became the loudest sound in the hospital. Morrison's hand had moved to his radio, but he wasn't calling for security. He was calling for his commanding officer. The three-star general arrived 9 minutes later, a woman with silver hair and the kind of presence that made the air pressure change when she walked through a door. She carried a service jacket so thick with commendations that the leather had faded to the color of old bone. She stood in the doorway of the conference room where they'd moved Brooke, and she began to read. Not announce. Read. Like every word was testimony. 3 Navy crosses. The general paused. Morrison's hand went to his chest. For valor in direct engagement with hostile forces. Another pause. The attending physician's pen fell from his fingers. 2 silver stars. The general's voice carried the weight of every decision Brooke had made in split seconds that meant the difference between 12 bodies coming home or 13. 47 confirmed combat saves. The general looked up from the jacket, her eyes meeting Brooke's. Over 31 years of service. Master Chief, the hospital security system captured what happened during Colonel Chen's emergency treatment. The door opened. Chen stood there in hospital scrubs, his surgical wound still healing beneath sterile dressing, but his posture was the posture of a soldier who had found something he'd been missing for 20 years. "She covered me," he said simply. His voice didn't shake. Military voices don't shake when they're telling the truth. When the compound detonated in Marjah, she was already moving. Shielded my body with hers. I was 10 years old. She called in airstrikes on her own position to get the medical team in. He looked at each person in the room. "She's the reason I'm alive. Twice now." Dr. Caldwell had been in the hospital that morning. The hospital board had scheduled an emergency meeting to review the credential irregularities he'd flagged against Brooke. He'd walked in confident, rehearsed, prepared to present documentation of her unauthorized procedure and gross violation of scope of practice. He'd made it as far as the elevator before his phone rang. The voice on the other end belonged to Dr. Harrison Chen, a retired cardiovascular surgeon and full professor at UC San Diego Medical School. David Chen's uncle. A man who had watched his nephew nearly die in this hospital and then watched a civilian nurse perform an emergency pericardiocentesis with the precision of a surgeon who had done the procedure in field conditions 1,000 times. More importantly, Dr. Harrison Chen had received a message from a resident who'd recorded Brooke's identity reveal on his phone. The video had been uploaded to a secure server. The evidence was catalogued. "Dr. Caldwell," Harrison Chen said into the phone, each word deliberately spaced. "I just watched a video of you attempting to destroy the woman who saved my nephew's life. Twice." The line went dead. Within 50 minutes, 3 separate calls reached the hospital board. Harrison Chen called demanding a full audit of the billing department. A lawyer representing Brooke Sullivan called requesting cooperation in a personnel dispute matter with potential federal implications. And a woman identifying herself as a naval intelligence liaison called requesting immediate cooperation in an ongoing investigation. The chief of staff, a man named Richardson who had been in Caldwell's orbit for 7 years, suddenly felt very alone. He pulled Caldwell's department files. The phantom equipment charges that Brooke's meticulous documentation had flagged. The inflated pharmaceutical orders. The pattern of billing codes that made no medical sense but made perfect financial sense if you understood what you were looking at. $211,000 over 18 months. The embezzlement wasn't sophisticated. It was systematic. It was the work of someone who believed he was too well connected to ever be audited. The emergency board meeting took 17 minutes. Caldwell started with his prepared defense. She performed an unauthorized procedure outside her scope. A board member whose daughter was a Navy SEAL cut him off. She saved Colonel Chen's life, Doctor. Your own orders restricted her access to a deteriorating patient. Why would you do that? Caldwell had no answer that survived the sound of his own voice trying to give it. His medical license was suspended within 48 hours. His department access was revoked the same day. The security system flagged his badge when he tried to enter the building on day 3, and he was escorted out by Morrison, who made a point of being very polite about it. The partners on the hospital board who'd benefited from his fraud stopped returning his calls. His office was cleared out by noon the following Tuesday, and as he carried the last box past the 4th-floor nursing station, a junior nurse, the same one he'd intimidated for months, said loudly to another nurse, "You think he'll need a security escort on his way out?" The laughter that followed had a quality of release to it. The relief of people who'd been holding their breath for 6 months. 6 months later, the hospital had a new department head. Brooke Sullivan worked openly as Colonel Chen's VA liaison, her Master Chief rank now visible on the ID badge that hung from her neck. The badge was different from the civilian credential. Older. Heavier. True. Chen brought his unit to visit once a month, rotating duty schedules so that a constant rotation of green berets moved through the hospital's halls, and the message was clear: this woman was protected, this woman was valued, and this woman had saved their commander's life. On her office shelf sat 2 objects. The first was a photograph in a thin frame, a 10-year-old Afghan boy standing beside a woman in military uniform, his face small and serious, his eyes the eyes of someone who'd already seen the worst the world had to offer. The second was a pair of combat boots. Size 3 children's. The leather was cracked, the soles worn smooth by 2 decades of preservation, the laces still tied in a tight double knot from the last morning they'd been fastened in Marjah. Dr. Caldwell taught CPR and first aid to disengaged community college students for $18 an hour. A former colleague saw him at a coffee shop one morning and turned away without speaking. The hospital's audit led to 3 board members resigning and a complete restructuring of billing oversight. A federal investigation was opened, then closed, then opened again, because some paperwork requires documentation that only certain agencies can access. Chen's daughter, 7 years old and fearless in the way children of soldiers are fearless, asked Brooke one afternoon how she stayed so calm when everyone had been so mean. Brooke picked up the worn combat boots and turned them over in her hands, feeling the weight of 20 years settle into her palms like muscle memory. "Some missions take decades to complete," she said. Her voice had changed. It carried the weight of authority now, the weight of someone who'd spent 31 years making impossible decisions and living with them. And you never know when the person you save is going to save you back. Chen stood beside them at the window overlooking San Diego, the sprawl of the city bright and ordinary under the afternoon sun. "True class is what you do when the lights go out," he said. She had the lights out for 20 years. If you haven't already, please subscribe for more untold stories of hidden heroes. Like this video and comment below, what would you have done in Brooke's position?